This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
1645. 1645. So 1644 was that of education. 1644 is also where Areopagitica comes out. And then 1645, he publishes a collection of poems. So imagine, he's one of the most prominent writers of pamphlets and tracts and things like that. He writes this huge statement for free speech that's still referred to sometimes now. He writes this big thing on of education that was, though it wasn't perhaps influential in the notion of it actually lasting into current systems, it was certainly read by a wide number of people and thought about and discussed. And then he publishes a collection of poems in 1645 while the English Civil War is raging all around him. Now, let's see. So, and here's a good example of some things that Milton liked to do. Again, remember, he likes being attacked. He likes the game of you tried to get me, now I'm going to get you. He puts out this collection of poems, 1645, and there's an engraving used for the frontispiece, and it was very botched for whatever reason. It makes Milton, who was, again, as we've said, a fairly handsome man, it makes him look old and weird, frankly. And Milton didn't care for this, and he got his revenge by adding some Greek to the frontispiece, knowing that the man who engraved the frontispiece didn't speak Greek or read Greek. Okay, so let me give you this real quick. So this is what he wrote in Greek. Where did it go? Quote, "You would say perhaps that this portrait was drawn by an ignorant hand, once you look at the living face. So friends, since you did not see the likeness, laugh at the botched effort of this incompetent artist." That was in the frontispiece of his own book. Assaulting the artist who made the cover art, basically.
Wow. I feel like this guy would fit in. I feel like our world, I can see how our world emerged from the milieu that this guy was moving in and from to a degree, from his influence. Mm-hmm. We really don't have, and it's ironic because it does sort of point toward predetermination. Although, of course, I'm a firm free will believer. Both sort of, theologically, but also just like on my own. I've sort of thought my way to that conclusion as much as you can. But it's just sort of like the world that we inherit. Like, no, literally some goofball in the early 17th century had a stick up his ass and long hair and kind of like with not that large a number of people
Right.
invented the modern world. And even our own style today, you could sort of see how this guy would have a killer Twitter account. He'd be dangerous.
I was just
He,
gonna say, like,
mm-hmm,
we've talked, we think a lot of. I mean, we're very online writers, right? So we think about this, and we've had, I think, other subjects we've covered who may have been better posters in terms of wittier or
mm-hmm.
something, but I don't think anybody would have loved the game as much as Milton of discourse and polemics. Like he would have loved being on Twitter during any
Yeah,
election or any whatever, right?
sure. Yeah, and
Yeah,
he probably would just love getting a ratio out of
right,
like
right,
ratioing somebody to oblivion.
right, right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Huh. It's so interesting, man.
Yeah. Now, sometime in late 1644, 1645, Mary Powell came back. Um, this is likely. Now, this wasn't because she was still in love with him. Probably what was happening with the tides of war changing, Powells, who were royalists, thought she would be safer living with Milton than living with them. This is most likely the reason for this. In July of 1645, shortly after Mary Powell came back, the entire Powell family came to live with the Miltons. Uh, Milton didn't like these people. They had owed his family money for decades. They had basically, you know, trying to put yourself in the mindset. You ask for this woman's hand in marriage. The father says okay, and then 2 months later she's back with them, and he's not, like, his responsibility, the father, would be to send her back. There's like, they're just not following any of the conventions. They owe him a bunch of money. Now they're suddenly showing up at his door and they're like, okay, we live with you now. um yeah, it's just a very crazy situation. um yeah, so now it was around this time that now, sure, while the Powells were living with Milton, the patriarch of the Powell family died, and due to this and some additional uh, legal action, basically Milton got most of the Powell estate, but there was hardly anything left. Um, uh, but let me
And
give you
say what you want about the modern world or the contemporary world. I mean, at least you aren't owing your neighbor your mortgage.
right.
I mean, it
And
is.
you could go
I
to
mean, the
jail
system.
for owing money too.
Yeah, they could send you over. They'd send you to Australia or to
Right.
to the Americas.
Yeah.
God
Yeah.
forbid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's about around this time, from quoting from the biography. Quote, unusually, we do have some direct evidence as to how Milton felt during all of these events, that is, the Powell family living with him, etc. A letter arrived unexpectedly from Milton's Italian friend Carlo Dati, and Milton soon answered it, though in general, as he had admitted to Diodati, he was not a good correspondent. He complains in indirect terms about the Powell entourage, saying, quote, daily sit beside me, exhaust me, torment me as often as they please. Talks about the recent deaths, Diodati, his own father, his old friends Alexander Gill and Catherine Thomason, and the general chaos of revolutionary London. And yet, in the midst of all that, he says, quote, I am forced to live in almost perpetual solitude, in an unusually revealing mark. He misses his Italian friends and especially the carefree life he had led there. It had been a tumultuous time, but he had still, he proudly tells his friend, been able to publish his poems. So, yeah, just a little peek into Milton's mind and a direct correspondence. Now, back to the war stuff, because Milton, as I said, Milton is rising in prominence as the war is raging, as Cromwell is approaching Lord Protectorship. The king was brought to trial in January of 1649. Milton was likely in attendance at the Great Hall in Westminster when this happened. In fact, Milton's own personal lawyer presided over the court that put King Charles on trial. During the prolonged proceedings, Milton wrote his work, another famous polemical work called The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. It was basically a defense of the army and the existing government now that Charles I was off the throne. And further, he justifies the right of the people to execute a sovereign. I'm not going to read any parts of it, but let me just give you the full title of this thing, and it'll tell you pretty much what it's all about. This is the full title of the tract. The tenure of kings and magistrates, proving that it is lawful and hath been held so through the ages for any who has the power to call to account a tyrant or wicked king, and after due conviction to depose and put him to death, if the ordinary magistrate have neglected or denied to do it, and that they who of late so much blame deposing are the men that did it themselves. Okay. He's calling for the head of the king in published materials. Couldn't be any problems doing that, right? That's not gonna be a problem. Okay.
Well, if you come at the king, you best not miss. That's what
right.
I've heard.
That's right. Okay. Let me read this bit.
I hope everybody's enjoying this episode on the life of John Milton that the great Brad Kelly is walking us through. We're what, probably
like
two and a half-ish hours into this. And I've already learned a ton.
Good.
It's a real pleasure to do this, Brad. How are you feeling? Let's check in real quick before you proceed. How are you feeling about right now?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. You know, there's a lot. The thing about this one is it's interesting. What's interesting about it to me, there's a lot of things, is the amount of things that Milton is first at doing, and we're going to see this even more in Paradise Lost. And then also the way in which, though we don't get a lot of personal anecdotes about him, you can start to see the kind of person he was through what he's doing, and you can see clearly how he would fit into contemporary society. Like it's enough the same that I can see Milton in 2023 and how he would roll. And it's interesting, right? And you see we talk about the country's never been as divided as it is now. I'm not saying it's not divided, but like literally these people were calling for each other's heads. Like, in print,
and they had the means to do it.
Right.
Yeah. In another universe, in an alternate reality, this episode is called John Milton, the Eternal Anglo.
Yeah, let's not do that, but I dig
it. Continue. Where were we? I'm really enjoying it. I'm gonna top off my water again, but I am listening. And yes,
I got a quote here. So the king is about to be executed. Quote, the king was executed on January 30th, 1649. An eyewitness records a dismal universal groan as the axe fell. King Charles met his final moments with dignity as he knelt on the black-draped scaffold with outstretched arms. Milton's young friend Andrew Marvell described the scene in these famous lines. This is Andrew Marvell, not Milton. While round the armed bands did clap their bloody hands, he nothing common did or mean upon the memorable scene. But with his keener eye the axe's edge did try, nor called the gods with vulgar spite to vindicate his helpless right, but bowed his comely head down as upon a bed. Bravely though the king faced his end, England had abolished its monarchy and started the first modern revolution. Okay. Now, here's another thing. First modern revolution. Milton was also the first person of any standing to defend the regicide in print. But the New Republic was instantly vilified throughout Europe, and a new book, supposedly written by the king himself, dominated the public space. So this is another part of the issue. Okay, you got rid of your king. Oh, shoot. Turns out that every single person in Europe thought that was a bad idea. And now you're trying to, but you still got to, it's just like now in many ways, you still have to trade with some of these people. You still have to be on good terms. You don't want France invading. You don't want the sense that there's a power vacuum. And if some strong, somebody could strong arm their way in and take over, it's very delicate times, even in the sort of regional community, right? Now, this regicide thing is put Milton on the shit list of many thinkers for many, many years. Even those who generally respect his work, right? Even Paradise Lost respecters say, that thing with the king, though, that was a bit much. Samuel Johnson, deep into the 1700s, in his book Life of Milton, was incensed by this aspect of Milton's life, especially when Milton later criticized harshly, but funnily also, this book that the king had supposedly written while he was in prison. This book that the king had supposedly written was called Icon Basilique, or The King's Image. This was circulating in 1649. And again, as I said before, widely read on the continent. And Milton wrote pamphlets or tracts or whatever we want to call them, basically making fun of it. He wrote one called Iconoclast, about basically just bashing this text that had been written. And we're gonna get to that in a little bit, because now with the king gone, dead, the popularity of the king's book, that the book that the king had written, required somebody to mount an articulate, powerful, and effective response. So the new government had to, they couldn't just let this book be out there without a counter to it. And there was nobody better to do this than Milton. And so they basically hired Milton to write this response. Milton would be the first contracted employee of the government after the English Revolution.
Whoa, he was in it.
He was in
Whoa.
it. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Now let me give you a description. Now this job writing this thing led to other things. Where is it? So so they hire him to write this response to the king's book. His response is called Iconoclastes. But then they also realized that, hey, hold on, we got like kind of a genius on our hands. Maybe he's more useful to us. This is from the biography. It was also his mastery of Latin that led to his appointment 2 days after being hired to write Iconoclastes as, quote, secretary for foreign languages, or in his alternative title, the Latin secretary. The salary was some amount of money a month. It doesn't matter because we don't know what that means anyway. For the first time, Milton had a real job. Within a week, Parliament abolished the House of Lords and the monarchy. Milton became, as I said, the first contractual employee. His job was to communicate with the rest of Europe in the midst of the crisis provoked by the death of the king and the new state of England as a commonwealth. He had to protest the attacks of exiled royalists, including the murder of Parliament's envoy to The Hague, a man who had taught history at Cambridge, and also the murder of the ambassador to Spain. So he's gone. I just track what has happened to him now. He's popular on campus as a college kid, but he never really went anywhere with it. It's a world-class education, but all he did was resign himself to his personal directed course of study. He becomes an increasingly prominent cultural commentator, polemicist, and controversialist, and kind of a minor poet. And now suddenly he is way up in the revolutionary government after calling for the head of the king, or justifying the the killing of the king. Right? It's an interesting arc, and you try to imagine that kid when he was young, and his dad's trying to tell him basically to get out of the house and get a job, and about 10 years later, he's sitting in the same room as the most powerful people in the country. It's just interesting. Now, there's a few issues with him taking this job. One, he's 44 years old, and he's getting a little bit older, and he's going blind in one eye. This is going to get worse. As I said before, when he writes Paradise Lost, he's completely blind. This is the other thing. Despite his general, for the time, sort of liberalism, calling for tolerance, except for Catholics, wanting the printing press press to be free, people to be able to get divorced, and people to have more autonomy. He, believing in this sort of utopian idea that people are capable of self-rule. This new government wasn't exactly an egalitarian utopia, as you might imagine, right? They might have said a lot of nice things in public, but there were issues for sure. really what you've got is the monarchy's out, and now a bunch of other people who want power are in. In some ways, probably for the average person, the difference probably may have not even been that big, really, between the two. Stuff stops blowing up for 5 minutes, maybe, while the new government's figuring things out. Milton probably had more in common ideologically with people like the levelers and the ranters than he did with somebody like Cromwell. These groups were basically populist liberals. They were committed to popular sovereignty. They wanted extended suffrage. They wanted equality under the law, and they wanted religious tolerance. At this time, these are all things Milton is into. But during the wars, Milton's politics and the levelers' writings were criticized by much of the same people. So he had common enemies with some people who ended up imprisoned in the Tower of London. And it's not clear exactly why Milton wouldn't have been, but we're going to get there. The thing that I wondered as I'm reading this is Milton gets appointed to this position is, does he know how dangerous this is? Like personally, right? Like, yeah, okay, you and a bunch, like, because it just calls to mind the fact that, like, again, the government just is whoever happens to be in the control room right now. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's really they're just a bunch of people in a room. And if a bunch of people like, if a strong enough force wants to be in that room and kick you out, then you're gone, right? So does Milton know how dangerous this is and how easily he could lose his head at any moment? It's not totally clear.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I mean, he must be aware, but it's hard to say. Mm-hmm. He's a long way from the Cambridge pub talking trash to the other students.
Yeah. And that's the arc that I found most interesting. Is you can see it. There's the wit and the intelligence, but also like the public prominence happening in those parties. And he just keeps playing that game. It's basically playing that same game. It's you attack me, I attack you. Oh, I can make a smarter argument than you, so I'm right. These people should. And then eventually you're like, oh crap, we're in charge now. Like, Hey,
did you see what happened to the last guy?
Right. Yeah. If I remember right, that guy got his head chopped off.
Hey.
Now, he had to. Now, here is a great irony. He got another assignment. The writer of the Areopagitica, an enormous statement about the freedom of speech and especially about prior restraint. He was assigned by Cromwell's administration to be a censor, or as Forsyth calls him, a spy catcher. His job became to approve of publications. Now,
irony. Irony is rich.
Right. Mm-hmm. Now, it seems that he was willing to let stuff he disagreed with pass. He let pro-royalist publications come out. So it seemed like he was trying to live up to his principles, but it is interesting that, like, suddenly this is his job to be the guy to do it, when in his opinion, it shouldn't be happening at all. Very strange, ironic situation.
In a way, that's the guy you want in the position, though, because he's thought deeply about it. And hey, put your money where your mouth is, buddy.
Right. And that may have been his justification to himself, is like, listen, they're going to do that. They're going to have this position whether I want them to or not. If I'm here, maybe I can actually care. Like what you're saying, I'm the right guy for this job because I'm not trying to repress things for ideological reasons. It's interesting. Now, we're going to talk more about his blindness now. He was blind in one eye when he was appointed to brought into the government 1649. 1652, he's basically entirely blind. This is from either glaucoma or from cataracts. Nobody really knows for sure. On March 29th, 1652, his vision finally goes. According to legend, it was the same day as a total eclipse of the sun. Who knows how true that is? I'm sure that's the date the eclipse happened. Whether he actually went blind on that date is another matter. He refers to it, what he could see, he refers to as, quote, pure black marked as if with extinguished or ashy light. So that's what he's seeing all the time now. He's okay, so a few weeks after he goes blind, his daughter Deborah is born. A few days after that, and by the way, I should have mentioned, and they're going to come up more later, because in the After Dark, we're talking about Milton's relationship with his daughters. Mary Powell, his first wife, had given him, I think, 4 children. After his daughter Deborah was born, a few weeks later, Mary Powell died. And I think shortly after that, his son died. But anyway, when she died, she left him with 3 children, including an infant. And he's blind. Which is, I'm trying to imagine that, right? He blamed, for the death of his son, he blamed, quote, an ill-chosen nurse, and probably blamed himself for basically putting his son in the hands of a nurse who was not equipped to take care of him. Yeah. Let's read his sonnet on blindness. Yeah, so it is interesting to think. I mean, I don't feel like this episode has been particularly dark yet, but I feel like this is a moment where it's like, oh man, this is a hard life, actually. Like, I know he's a trust fund kid and all of that, but this is a difficult situation for anybody. Okay, this is called Sonnet 16, and this is basically about his blindness. Quote, when I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my maker and present my true account, lest he returning chide, doth God exact day labor, light denied. I fondly ask, but patience to prevent, that murmur soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts, who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly, thousands at his bidding speed, and post o'er land and ocean without rest, they also serve who only stand and wait. Okay. Now, in attempts to cure his blindness, Milton would subject himself to a range of procedures, none of which worked. This included various potent medicines. This included bloodletting by making small incisions to his eyelids and around his eyes and letting them bleed.
Ooh, that doesn't sound good. Ooh, I don't like that.
No, no, and you know that blade isn't clean. No.
I want to be the guy who cleans the eye blade.
Right. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Now, you can imagine at a time like this that for a man who had any number of enemies, as Milton did, and was going blind and was a public figure, a lot of people basically said that his blindness was God punishing him. Now, in public, Milton sort of laughed that off and kind of said that that was ridiculous. But in private, he wasn't quite so sure. He suspected he'd had some digestive trouble as well, and later on he would have very serious gout. But he had some digestive trouble, and he believed, for whatever reason, possibly a doctor told him this was the case, that the digestive trouble had led to the blindness, and that the digestive trouble had started because of something he ate. So eating something that he shouldn't have eaten leads to blindness. There's again a sort of a biblical allegory there, though, right? This concept that he has eaten something he hasn't, and now he's sort of doomed. Now, he's going to make efforts to justify his blindness and figure out a way in which this blindness is actually the grace of God and part of Paradise Lost, and is an attempt to sort through that. And we'll get to that sort of when we come to it. let me read real quick part of part of a letter he wrote to a doctor about his blindness. This is while he's publicly saying, he's sort of publicly laughing off the idea that God struck him blind because of his heresies and for, going against the king and all that. But this is what he's saying to his doctor, if I have it.
Gotta remember, and he's like in his late 30s now.
He would be, what's this? This is 1652, so he would be,
so he'd be older,
44.
Yeah, 40. So kind of an old man at this point.
A little bit,
like in that time, a little bit. Yeah.
He's getting up there for sure.
The plague could knock you out at any day.
Yes.
So are you telling me that does he live to see the Great Fire? I guess you'll have to tell me.
He does.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me read this bit from this letter. It's long. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Quote, but I must not omit that while considerable sight still remained, when I would first go to bed and lie on one side or the other, abundant light would dart from my closed eyes. Then, as sight daily diminished, colors proportionately darker would burst forth with violence and a sort of crash from within. But now, pure black, marked as if with extinguished or ashy light, and as if interwoven with it, pours forth. Yet the mist which always hovers before my eyes, both night and day, seems always to be approaching white rather than black. And upon the eyes turning, it admits a minute quantity of light as if through the crack. Although some glimmer of hope, too, may radiate from that physician, I prepare and resign myself as if the case were quite incurable. And I often reflect that since many days of darkness are destined to everyone, as the wise man warns, mine thus far, by the signal kindness of Providence, between leisure and study, and the voices and visits of friends, are much more mild than those lethal ones. But if, as it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God, why should one not likewise find comfort in believing he cannot see by eyes alone, but by the guidance and wisdom of God? Indeed, while he himself looks out for me and provides for me, which he does, and takes me as if by the hand and leads me throughout life, surely, since it has pleased him, I shall be pleased to grant my eyes a holiday. So he's trying to justify, he's trying to find a way. I think what most people do who survive losing something like your eyesight or whatever, you try to find sort of the silver lining in it, or find ways to psychologically deal with it. Right. And we definitely see Milton doing that. But it becomes, I mean, it's an important part of Paradise Lost as well. Let's see. I think we'll talk let's talk a little bit more about okay, there's one more public fight that Milton has that's pretty good. All right. So as I said, there's all these groups like sort of scrabbling for whatever little bit of power and influence they can get. Ranters, Quakers, Levelers, Muggletonians, Fifth Monarchists, the proto-communist Diggers, all these other people. They're all holding meetings. They're all disrupting public space. Milton actually was trying to encourage Cromwell to tolerate all of these groups as long as they weren't Irish Catholics. He basically thought, hey, they should be able to have their say. But it was, for Milton, getting ugly trying to hold to the virtues of Areopagitica, right? The free speech absolutist kind of attitude. And there was still very vigorous debate about the regicides. This killing the king never went away as an issue, and the fact that Milton had been in favor of it. There was a widely read tract sometime in the mid-1650s called Regi Sanguinis Clamor that targeted Milton specifically about the regicides, likening Milton to the Cyclops, basically calling him monstrous, deformed, and sightless. Funnily enough, Milton mistakes who the screed is actually written by and spends the next couple of years just dogpiling the wrong person in public. Even after his friends are like, Milton, dude, John, that's not who wrote this thing. This other guy wrote it. Milton just carries on writing these assaults and printing them and sending them out into public. At one point, he says, how lucky the fish were in the market that they had a bunch of paper that they would get to be wrapped by, which was this guy's writing. He's basically saying its best use of his writing, this other guy's writing, was as fish wrappers for fish in the market. Also, Milton used his contacts in Geneva, because he knew people in Geneva, to get dirt on this guy, Alexander Moore, who, again, did not write the attack on Milton, and yet Milton just kept going after him. And Milton apparently knew the guy didn't write it. He just delighted in going after this guy, apparently. Milton used his contacts in Geneva to get dirt on this affair that Alexander Moore had with a servant girl, and then publicly put him on blast for that. Again, because he had thought that Alexander Moore wrote this screed against him, which he didn't, and yet he just wouldn't give up the fight. So,
damn.
Yeah,
wow.
Very like he didn't
dog it.
And it's like he had fun with it.
Monomania.
Yeah.
You would not want to be on the other side of his pen.
No, not at all, because you're going to get bored of it. And he's going to still be going. You're like, I don't care, man. Okay, now here's another kind of something that's sort of been lost in this talking about him, becoming sort of a bureaucrat or whatever we want to call this position. He's still committed to poetry. There's just, I think, the sense that we read earlier about he wanted to do what he thought was in the public good. And I think he probably saw his opportunity here to actually participate in something. And who knows how much exactly he agreed with Cromwell on. But it was his opportunity to be in the room and maybe help guide some things. And some people have said that Milton writing, Milton wasn't just responsible for writing letters to the continent, just dictating whatever Cromwell said. Many people suggest that Milton was somewhat of a silent architect in the foreign policy decisions of the Cromwell administration, which makes sense. You've got
that
this
doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, you got this super smart guy writing the letters. I mean, just let him do it. I don't know. What are we going to tell him? So, just pretty interesting. 1656, he remarries a woman named Catherine Woodcock. Note that he would never see her in person. I just think that's a relevant detail. She was 28. He was 48. She was apparently indulgent.
Age gap.
Yeah, definitely.
For the bingo card.
Yeah, 20-year age gap. She apparently was very good with the children, with his children from a previous marriage. Milton gets a dedicated assistant. So the Cromwell administration gives him a dedicated assistant who is the young poet Andrew Marvell, who was a good friend of Milton's already. And this frees him up to work on some other stuff he wanted to do. For instance, write the history of Britain. I debated how much to go into the history of Britain, and I've decided that we're going to kind of just gloss over it. It is an attempt to write the history of Britain, which up until that time had not really been attempted. Milton was probably one of a handful of people who had read widely enough to actually do it. But it's interesting, the fact that he's blind. How is he doing any of this stuff? Mostly he has an amanuensis, I think. When you have a person that you read to and they do the writing, they do the typing.
I'm not familiar with that word.
I think it's amanuensis. I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Amanuensis. Yeah, I'm looking it up.
Yeah, look it up. Make sure I'm not mispronouncing it.
Amanuensis.
Okay.
Yeah, a literary or artistic assistant, in particular, one who takes dictation or copies manuscripts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So he would have a number of these. They would be, sometimes they were former tutors, students, former students of his. Later on, he would have his daughters read to him when they could. And famously, he would have them read him maybe Latin and supposedly Greek. And he basically never bothered to teach them Greek. So for hours at a time, one or the other of his daughters would basically just have to make the mouth noises that correspond to the letters on paper for hours. They didn't know what it meant, but they knew the letters and how it was supposed to sound.
Oof.
And he would have them do that for hours. Could you imagine just like you had to go read Chinese for 3 hours to your dad, who you don't really like, every day? Like, what? It sounds terrible.
That sounds like
terrible.
a chore. Yeah, that doesn't sound like good fun. And of
No.
course, we're in England, we're in London.
Yeah.
It's raining all the time. It's
Right.
probably drafty.
Yeah.
Yeah. He can't tell that it's getting dark. Well, light the candle.
Right.
Light a candle.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
What an
Yeah. Rough.
adventure John Milton is
Yeah.
having. And he hasn't even begun Paradise Lost.
Paradise Lost is not even started. He at this time he knows that he wants to write a great epic poem, but he believes it's going to be about King Arthur. Eventually, he
Okay,
changes his mind.
so he moves from this sort of pagan theme, although the Arthurian legend is sort of mixed up with Christian stuff. But I think fundamentally it's like about Arthur's supposed to be a pagan king.
Yeah.
And same with the Mask. It was sort of like these pagan themes. Yeah, but then finally he settles on the great subject. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. I'm going to run through a few things here before we get to Paradise Lost, because there's a couple interesting points, but we're not going to dwell for too long on any one thing. February of 1658, his new wife Catherine gives birth to a new baby girl, but she dies almost immediately. She dies 3 months later because she's still weak from labor, and the new infant daughter also died. So Milton has had 2 of his children die, 2 of his wives have died. This wife he actually seems to have loved. And wrote some sonnets or poems too. We get basically no writing, no kind of romantic writing about Mary Powell at all, apparently. He writes sometime in here, the Doctrine of Christianity, which is a big, long theological treatise that is sort of rediscovered it's never published in his lifetime. It comes out sometime in the 1820s. I kind of debated how much to talk about this, but I actually think the more interesting theological document is Paradise Lost. So I think we'll just kind of focus our energies there, but know that he wrote a massive Doctrine of Christianity book.
I'm fully expecting for us to get to Paradise Lost. You've got 3 or 4 bullet points. We'll move speedily on and we'll get to the After Dark for Patreon.
Right.
Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. If you appreciate the work that goes into these podcasts, please support us. We are trying to grow something. There's an article going around right now about how the artistic directors of theater companies, these hack regional theater companies, even during COVID, were being paid salaries of $250,000, $900,000 at the public, and how artists are not getting paid. Creative people are not getting paid. And this author, it's something in the Washington Post. Just a little sidebar here.
Yeah.
Monica Byrne is her name. She's making the case that we've got to fund artists directly. Well, can you imagine what your average small theater company in a town like like St. Paul or Detroit could do with one person's salary per year devoted just to making work? $250,000. You could do incredible things. That's one person's salary at one of these bloated, dead institutions.
So mostly so that person can stand around at cocktail parties and tell people they directed. Yeah, they're
correct, and look fashionable. I have no doubt that some of those artistic directors are very earnest and very genuine people, but they're caught up in a system that everybody knows it's dead and dying. So what we're talking about with Patreon for Brad and me is direct material support for a couple of working artists who are also making a podcast that hopefully you like and appreciate. It's not that hard. If you're enjoying this, if you listen to 1, 2, 5, 10 core episodes and you haven't gone out of your way to chuck a buck on Patreon, or now to go and throw us whatever you think it's worth. Call it value for value. If we've given you value, throw something our way, because Brad and I, this consumes a lot of our lives. This is not the kind of prep that Brad has done for this. Doesn't happen overnight. He's not doing 2 days of prep and then dropping a 4 or 5 hour thoughtful banger on John Milton. It takes weeks of thinking and reading and all the rest of it. So if you value that, put a dollar value on it and actually back a couple of people who are doing it. And that is patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod or PayPal through artofdarkpod.com. What are we talking about on the After Dark, Brad?
We are going to talk more about Milton's relationship with his daughters. It gets very interesting. There's a hot debate about where Milton's money is going to go. And we're going to talk about what happened one drunken night to Milton's bones.
I'm really excited. That'll be on the After Dark one final time, patreon.com/shortofdarkpod. I'll also say we love all our listeners. And if your economic situation doesn't let you, you don't have any extra money to go around, that's fine. Go and 5-star the pod, 5-star it on Spotify, on iTunes. Leave a nice review.
Yeah.
Share the podcast with your friends. We can all pull together to make the culture a little more of an art of darkness type culture, a culture that thinks about arts and letters and John Milton and his crazy influence on Walter Sobchak from The Big Lebowski.
Right.
Where else are you going to get this kind of conversation? I don't think it exists. I think we're the only ones doing it. You're listening. You've made it this far in this episode. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the remainder of it. Brad, take it away.
Yes. So in 1661, in 1660, let's back up a second. 1658, Cromwell dies. His son takes over. His son is not fit to rule. 2 years later, King Charles's son, King Charles II, returns to the throne. And now we have to remember, Milton has works for the new government. Milton had called or had justified the execution of the new king's father. This does not go well. In fact, Milton, at one point, when they were essentially seizing the throne, seizing the king's estates, they'd said to Milton, the Cromwell administration said, hey, if you want to pick out a couple pieces of art out of the king's hall here, go ahead, take that home. You want that sculpture? Take it. So literally Milton had, plundered treasures from the king in his home. Right.
Whoa. And now Charles II is here.
Is back.
Electric Boogaloo.
Right.
You killed my dad.
Yes. Not good.
No real. This is like a movie.
It is. Milton goes into hiding. He knows how dangerous this is now. Now it's real, right?
John Milton becomes Gone Milton. I'm out of here. I'm hiding.
Yeah.
That when we write the biopic, that's what'll be what it's called. Yeah. Gone Milton.
Gone Milton. I like that. Oh boy, that's funny.
Who's gonna play John Milton? Who would play blind John Milton in hiding?
Yeah, I don't know.
And he's like, what? How old is he? Like 40, 50?
He would have been 58. He's 60. So he's like 40, 42. No. What would he be? He'd be 52. Sorry.
52.
Yeah. So in his early 50s, blind, not in particularly good shape. Their diet isn't great, all of those sorts of things. So he's just kind of withering.
Yeah, we can't get Philip Seymour Hoffman for obvious reasons. He would have been an artist we have to cover. What about Vince Vaughn? Can Vince Vaughn play
Vince Vaughn? That would be pretty interesting.
I'm just kidding. I don't know. Now we're making an imaginary movie. Yeah. But this is fascinating, man.
Yeah. Now the new parliament. I didn't give all of the reasons why the king returned to the monarchy, but let's just say that after the Cromwell administration, Cromwell dying, his son taking over and running it very ham-fisted manner, the people were calling for the monarchy to return. Parliament, it was suggested in Parliament that Milton be put to death. It almost didn't get enough. It didn't get enough support to actually be enacted, but his books were publicly burned, and 29 other people who participated or supported the regicide in one way or another were put to death. Milton ends up serving a couple of months in prison, and when he comes out, he basically has no money anymore because they'll just take your money. Right. But again, government is just who has control of violence. So if they want your stuff, they just take it.
Yeah. I mean, if you were involved in a movement that chopped off this guy's dad's head, if only your money is getting messed up, you're almost kind of dodging a bullet.
Yes.
At least you have your head.
Right.
Stakes be high.
Yeah, and this is how mad they were. This is how mad the new monarchy was. In 1661, they dug up the bodies of Cromwell and a few others, including Milton's former lawyer, the guy who ran the trial of the king, paraded them through the streets, cut off their heads, threw the bodies into a common hole, and then the hangman placed the heads of these figures, including Oliver Cromwell, on poles outside of Westminster Hall, where they remained for 13 years.
I think I knew about that.
Yeah.
That's metal. That is
That's
metal.
what you get for coming at the king, right?
The return of the monarchy.
Yes.
We are back. Yeah. And the New Monarchy would be a good name for a band. Wouldn't it? The New Monarchy.
It would be a good monarchy. Yeah. A couple other things as we're approaching Paradise Lost. 1663, Milton marries his third wife, a woman named Elizabeth Minshall. This is a 31-year age gap. According to Milton's nephew, Edward Phillips, this one oppressed Milton's children in his lifetime and cheated them at his death.
No.
1665, a plague that kills 1/5 of the population of London. 1666, the Great Fire of London. 13,000 houses or more burned, along with any number of buildings. A big deal. Apparently not a lot of deaths, but you can imagine the instability and the economic impact that such a thing might have. The next year, so imagine this. These historical events: 1665, plague kills 20% of the population. 1666, Great Fire of London. 1667, Paradise Lost is dropped. So this is what's going on around, this is what's going on around him. Milton is now safe from being persecuted criminally. He's sort of paid his dues, but he's pretty far from being at the right hand of the most powerful, executive power in the country. He's sort of kind of mostly broke, living off in a house outside, sort of outside of town. Now, what is Paradise Lost, everybody? Okay, Paradise Lost is an epic poem in blank verse, consisting of, some people say there's different printings. Excuse me. Some had 10 books, some have 12 books. A second edition followed in 1674. That's the one that people read now, usually, is the 1674, an adaptation of the 1674 edition with the spelling corrected and whatnot. The poem concerns the biblical story of the fall of man, the temptation of Adam and Eve by the fallen angel Satan, and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. It also concerns the war in heaven and the population of hell. It is properly called a theodicy, which is an attempt to justify the ways of God to man. So Milton at some point had decided that what his great epic would be, well, here's one thing. Why didn't he write initially he'd wanted to write, when he was a younger revolutionary, he wanted to write a nationalist epic. Arthurian legend totally makes sense, right? But you have to recognize his position in the 1650s, especially when the king comes back and all the chaos that happened when Cromwell was in place. Even then, I mean, he had his issues with that, and then the king returns. To Milton, at some point, there wasn't a nation worth writing a nationalist epic about. It hadn't worked. The whole thing was a folly. And so you're not going to write something celebrating your nation when in your mind it's a broken dream, right? So that's kind of what led him to write this instead. Now, a couple things about the style. It is arguably the first narrative poem in English to not rhyme, which seems normal. Rhyming poetry is a little awkward to us now, even if it's not in a song. But this is the first English poem and not to rhyme.
Yeah, like at that period, you go to the poem man, and you say, "Hey, poem man,
right?
Poem man, write me a poem, for my lady." And you expect him, the poem man, to come back and say, "Lo, the English rose, hath blown her nose upon the dilly dales, on her way on the road to Wales." Right. So it all rhymed. You heard I made up a rhymey poem.
That was great.
Yeah, you're welcome. I could do this on the fly. I'm a trained writer. I have an MFA.
It's got to be good for something.
I don't know what the dilly dales are, but I came up with it. But so in this case, you go to the poem man, and he comes back and he's just dropping no rhymes, and you're like, I want my rhymes.
Now so between the fact that it didn't rhyme, and then he wasn't, the first person to do this, but he went hard with it with what's called enjambment. And for people out there who don't know what enjambment is, basically it means when you don't have an end stopped line. So the convention would be to end each line with a comma or a period. Enjambment is when it continues on to the next line before you get that, right?
So there's no clear punctuation, or it's more that it crosses over to on the line break on the page.
It can be anywhere. It can be elsewhere on the page. It can be in the middle of a line or something.
I got
right?
you. Okay.
And part of this is he's trying to maintain some degree of iambic pentameter. I mean, that blank verse is basically iambic pentameter that doesn't rhyme. So he's doing it for those purposes. But as soon as you start doing enjambment, the interesting thing that you start to be able to do that you can't do as well when you've got end stopped lines. And I'm sorry if this is boring people, but this is actually, I think, relevant stuff to know to get a greater understanding. This is nuts and bolts poetry stuff.
This is why we're doing this pod. So don't apologize for doing this. We do have some degree of standing and understanding about this. So,
yeah. And I'm not a poet really, but I know a little bit. But what happens when you start using enjambment is you get to set up surprises within the clause of a sentence. So you get to the end of the line and the reader anticipates that the meaning is building towards one thing. And then when you cut to the next line, it sort of switches things up on you. It can go in a different direction, or you can read it without reading to the next line and it means one thing. But when you move down to the next line and include that, it means a second thing. It allows for an added degree of multivalency that available necessarily when you're end stopping lines. Anyway, Milton is using this hard, and it's not like he invented it, but maybe nobody before him had used it to the degree that he uses it, and he's playing games with it. The rhyming thing is so prominent. The fact that it didn't rhyme was so prominent that in a later edition, he had to write basically a preface that this is a little bit overstating it, but it's kind of funny to think about it this way because it's sort of what he is. That is basically said, listen, I know it doesn't rhyme. I'm not stupid. It's not supposed to rhyme. That's basically the argument of the thing.
Well, he even makes a little bit of a joke at the top. I mean, I'm looking at it right now. I found it online. And he even in the first, I guess, what do you call it? The first stanza, things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. So maybe he's aware. He's totally saying, aware. Is this prose? Am I rhyming? I'm being a cheeky little boy. I'm calling the muse, humbly calling the muse.
Yes. Now, a couple other things just on generalities, and we're going to get into some of the specifics of this thing. And I want to return to the fact that there's some discourse on the Bird's website the other day, and I may have fomented this as hard as my meager influence allows, about style versus substance. I'm of the style is substance and substance is style school a little bit more. There's nuance there, obviously. Milton is not doing this. I'm not rhyming. I'm going to enjam. I'm going to break pentameter from time to time. He's not doing that just for either laziness or just for fun. He's making a point and with it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in some specific instances. But first, a couple other things about this poem. He claimed that he was visited by an angel each night. She told him exactly what to say. And he woke up and he got his amanuensis into the room and said, write this down. And
I did not know this.
Yes.
I did not know this. This makes me think of Swedenborg. Okay. Yeah. I did not know that he claimed this was inspired by an angel.
Right. And it's funny if you read some like modern sources, like very contemporary sources, like if you read that, why you should reread Paradise Lost from the BBC that we mentioned, they'll say, Milton claimed that most of this was inspired in a fever dream. No, he said an angel came to him. You can't, just because we're a secular society, you can't pretend.
They're communist, Brad. Right. So I mean, it's okay.
You can't. That's what he said.
Right. Yeah.
You can
Well, he
decide that
really
angels
meant
aren't
that he
real.
was, yeah,
Yeah,
right. And this is a book about angels.
right.
So it seems germane.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Well, and this is why this is the point when I said very earlier that one, depending on how one looks at this, and I'm not making an argument for this, I'm just kind of throwing it out there as a concept. One could argue, if they wanted to, that Paradise Lost is an actual religious text, not a text about religion, but an actual religious text,
Well,
depending
this
on
is
if you believe.
again
Yeah.
reminiscent of Swedenborg, where
Mm-hmm.
Swedenborgians, they take that stuff pretty seriously. He
Right.
had revelation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Now, um, okay, we're gonna run through. I'm gonna. This is Kevin. I'll tell you. The challenge was how much time do we spend on Paradise Lost? I read the thing. Um,
You
Amazing,
poor son of a bitch. I mean,
grueling,
grueling,
hard,
hard.
fun, hypnotizing.
How
Uh,
many pages is it? I
It's
mean,
it's almost this entire book. I mean, it's not that
God,
many. It's probably 400 pages, but it's you got.
it's
I
one
had
of
to read a
those
lot of it
things you gotta,
twice.
yeah, you gotta read it twice and maybe take like 2 or 3 pages a day.
Yeah.
Methodical. You're not gonna read it like you read No Country for Old Men or
Yeah. You know what's
uh,
fascinating about this? And I will let me give my and I'll tell you right. This is the most difficult reading experience of my life, reading Paradise Lost. Um, I'm not ashamed to admit that. One thing I did notice though, the longer in an individual session, the longer I stuck with it, the more sense it made. It was like I would open it to a page and I'd start and be like, this doesn't make any sense. Like I cannot follow what he's talking about. 4, 5, 6, 7 pages in, it's starting like I'm starting to be able to follow it much more clearly. And then if I put it away and come back the next day, the whole process starts over again. It's weird. It's like it's pulling you into another language and it takes a minute for your brain to switch into that mode and you can kind of maintain it for a while. But yeah, it's a very interesting experience. Um anyway, okay, so let's actually get in. Oh, I just want to point out something. So remember we were talking about his stylistic innovations or breaking the rules. I want to point out the first I think it's the first, is it the first line? Um of man's first disobedience and the fruit. The one thing he does in the first line. So this is purportedly an iambic pentameter. You had
oh
to
my
write
God, we're
something.
gonna read the entirety of
Yeah,
Paradise Lost in this episode, aren't we?
yeah. It's the only way to do it, Kevin.
We do like an Andy Kaufman thing. Can you
Oh
imagine?
oh God, I couldn't do it.
70-hour
I couldn't
podcast.
do it.
Can you imagine? That would be the funniest thing we could possibly do right now, though,
Oh,
would be to commit to in
funny.
any case, yeah.
It would get some listens. Um,
I
the
think the
first
bounce rate would be pretty high, but yes,
it
go
would
on
be.
about the first line, yeah.
I'm gonna just read the first couple lines. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe. In this first two lines, he breaks several of the rules of what would be expected of him to write, which is a end-stopped rhyming iambic pentameter poem. He breaks rhyme, he enjams, and he breaks strict pentameter. And what I think he is doing here, and he talks about this in his sort of apology where he talks about it rhyming, is he's basically saying, um, those conventions have their value, but they also are constricting. They are limiting the ability for us to actually fully use this language to do the things that it can do aesthetically, conceptually, philosophically, and even religiously. And when we think about Milton being among the men who invented modern English, this is a this is like a volley in or a this is a attempt to push it forward a little bit. We don't have to do everything in iambic pentameter and make it rhyme. There's other stuff we can do. I just think to us none of these things seem radical, right? Because it's 2023, right? You can make a poem about anything and it doesn't have to have any structure to it at all.
And nobody will
Um,
read it.
Right, right. Yeah.
I
Now,
am joking.
yeah,
Poets, please
people
continue
will read it. I love
continue on.
poetry.
People will read it. I
Yeah.
love poetry. Yes,
Yeah.
we're
Shouts out to
poetry.
Tom Will's new book, Pale
Poetry.
Townie. Read that, please. Um,
I
uh,
jest. I
yes.
jest. Of course, yeah. We are
Um,
poetry respecters on this pod, or else we wouldn't bother to do
yeah,
X number of hours
of
on
course.
John Milton.
Book one. So I'm just going to tell you a few details about not maybe even each book, but book one is about the rebel angels following their failed revolution. Satan has tried to have a revolt in heaven against God. God kicks them out, sends them to hell. Mostly this book is kind of about setup. It's interesting that the battle has already failed rather than it being during the battle. Apparently, this is a sort of a trope in epic literature. Um, um, Interestingly, you do get Milton put in arguments for each book. So there's actually a pretty good summary for each book at the front of them in later editions that Milton himself wrote, and they're very handy. It's good to what I liked to do as I was reading it, and I would suggest this to you: read those before, then you read the book, and then go back to the argument and read the argument again. It sort of seals it in what that whole book was about. Okay. There is yeah. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit to give you Satan's appearance. We're kind of thinking about this whole idea that Milton made Satan sympathetic or an interesting character or something. Milton in large part invented the modern conception of what Satan is as a personality, and he does it in this book. As a
Wears
character.
leather, electric guitar.
Yes.
Cool at parties. Bit of a problem at the hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, let me read a little bit of this.
Show up on your deathbed. Yeah, go ahead.
This is book 1, line 281. Oh, this is another thing that Milton did first. Milton published this with the lines numbered. Not every line, but like every 5 or 10 or whatever. Nobody had ever done that before, except in like ancient, like if you had an old poem and you were like collecting it, you would publish it with the line, but no new book of poetry had ever had the lines. And this was I think Milton's statement of like, this belongs on the same shelf as Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, as Homer, as all these things. That's his way of telling you that. Anyway, here's Satan. He scarce had ceased when the superior fiend, that's Satan, the superior fiend, was moving toward the shore, his ponderous shield, ethereal temper, massy, large, and round. Behind him cast, the broad circumference hung on his shoulders like the moon whose orb through optic glass the Tuscan artist views. The Tuscan artist is Galileo. At evening from the top of Faesol or in Valdarno to descry new lands, rivers or mountains in her spotty globe, his spear to equal which the tallest pine hewn on Norwegian hills to be the mast of some great admiral, were but a wand. He walked with to support uneasy steps over the burning marl, not like those steps on heaven's azure, and the torrid climbs smore on him sore besides, vaulted with fire, nathless he so endured, till on the beach of that inflamed sea he stood and called his legions, angel forms, who lay entranced, thick as autumnal leaves. That's how it feels to read some of this stuff.
It's juicy and it's got recognizable characters we all know from the Bible: Adam, Eve, Satan, Jesus, the various angels. There's a lot there. Yeah.
Now, as we get into book 2, the demons are arguing about what they should do. They've been kicked out of heaven. They used to be angels. It was, I think, a third of the angels fought. The other two rebelled, and Satan later tells them that half, because he's trying to make an argument. He wants to encourage them, but it was really a third, because Satan is lying to everybody all the time in this book. But they have this argument, and it's great. It's this really cool. It feels like it's a great argument between three. I think 3 or 4. I think there's 3 primary arguments. One is that we basically just take our licking. We don't really do anything. One is that we basically beg for forgiveness. The problem with that is if we do that, and even if we are forgiven and brought back into heaven, we'll just be brought into the same circumstances that we rebelled against. What's the point of that? One is that we turn hell into heaven on our own. We're here, we're angels, we can probably do this. And then Satan's is like, we just stay at war. It's war all the time. What are you talking about? The revolution never ends until it's over. And this is sort of disputed about how this is going to be handled. It's one thing that's really interesting. Many of the fallen angels are actually pagan gods, are named pagan gods. Now, Milton isn't the first person to do this. Justin Martyr and Tertullian had similar ideas that the various Greek and other pagan gods were demons, basically. But Milton kind of populates this space with Moloch and Belial and Mammon, right? These are the fallen angels. It's just interesting stuff. Now, Satan hears from one of them that there is a new planet out there and that God has populated it with a couple strange creatures, human beings. And he's decided that this must be a weak spot for God, and he's going to go do something. And Satan elects himself to fly across chaos. It's a great scene. I'm not going to read it because you got to read the whole thing and it's kind of long. But there's this great scene of him flying across chaos to the gates of hell to escape. There he encounters these allegorical figures, sin and death. These just repulsive, like Lovecraftian figures. And apparently death is the offspring of Satan and sin. And he's like informed of this in a very strange move. And then Satan breaks out of hell. That's book 2. So book 1 and 2, you got Satan has busted out of hell. He's on his way to go do whatever he can to the humans in order to further his revolution. Again, revolution. Think about what Milton was part of. Just political.
Right. I'm already hearing all of the echoes of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, book 3 is in heaven. God talking about how basically God is sitting there. He's just created mankind, the Garden of Eden. The creation story has already happened. And he's basically says to his son, it's never referred to as Jesus Christ because that sort of hasn't actually happened yet, but it's God's son is there beside him. And it's implied that it's going to be Jesus, but it's not yet. And God basically says, so Adam's going to eat this fruit. It hasn't happened yet, but God knows that it's going to happen. And there's an interesting conversation about predestination versus free will. And it's like, well, how is he freely choosing if you already know what's going to happen? I mean, that's a fascinating theological conversation. And one that I think is and philosophical question. One that I think is worth taking seriously and trying to figure out where you stand on it. I think that's a worthwhile enterprise. God at one point says, I created man sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. And I think that's how a lot of people interpret that whole thing. You have free will, but there are consequences to doing the wrong thing. And if there weren't consequences, would it really be free will, right? So there's a lot going on. All of this is happening in this paragraph. Now, this is the kind of interesting thing that might be somewhat heretical, Milton's move here. The Son convinces God to accept Adam and Eve's repentance, right? So it's the Son who does this. And God says, yeah, this sounds like a good idea. And he says, I will place within them as a guide my umpire of conscience, and to the end persisting, safe arrive. So here's how we'll fix this. I'll put my voice in their head just a little bit, just so they can hear me when they're about to screw up, right? Interesting. Doesn't completely cancel out free will, right? Just because you've got one other thing that you're hearing doesn't mean you don't have free will, but it's narrowing your possibilities a little bit, maybe. Now, as soon as God has promised that he's going to do this, he says, but hold on. Man disobeying breaks his fealty, and so losing all. And basically, God says there was a deal. And they were supposed to follow me, and they didn't, and that must be paid for. It has to be. And how is that going to be paid for? By the sacrifice of his own son, right? So interesting. Let's see. Book 3. Sorry. Another thing goes on in book 3, interestingly, I think, is Milton tells his reader that he's blind. He invokes a muse in book 3 that is going to give him the holy light by which he will be able to write this volume. He's constantly invoking muse. And in fact, Milton, or the narrator, who we take to be Milton, is sort of a character in this. And it's certainly the experience of writing the poem is an experience that is shown in the poem happening. It's part of the structure of the poem, is the attempt to write the poem itself, which, again, there's a lot of things about sort of like postmodern literature that people were convinced was newfangled, and a lot of it had already been done. And this is definitely fourth wall. The writer stops to say, I'm blind, but if this muse would just help me, and it's kind of interesting, the stylistic things that he's up to. Also, another thing that he does really interesting is that every once in a while, God says something in a tense that doesn't quite make sense. Like, it's the wrong tense. And the common scholarly opinion on that is, well, for God, there really is no time, or at least not the way there is for us. So
that's pretty pomo. They would call that pomo, and clever. That's clever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
I think by postmodern, sometimes they just mean clever.
That's true. Well, cleverness by itself is neither a virtue nor a vice, I don't think. I think it's just a thing. I think it's good to be clever sometimes.
Yeah, neither is postmodernism.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Book 4, Satan Comes to Eden. We'll just
deep thoughts on the pod.
We're getting into the punchy hour here. Book 4, Satan Comes to Eden, sees Adam and Eve, creeps up to Eve's ear in the night, and is run off by the Archangel Gabriel. Okay, let me give you a quick, I don't know how quick it is, but a description of Eden from the book. What am I in? Book 4? Book 4, 213. Book 4, line 213 to 245. Where am I? Right here. In this pleasant soil, his far more pleasant garden God ordained. Out of the fertile ground he caused to grow all trees of noblest kind for sight, smell, taste, and all amid them stood the tree of life, high eminent, blooming ambrosial fruit of vegetable gold, and next to life our death, the tree of knowledge, grew fast by, knowledge of good bought dear by knowing ill. Southward through Eden went a river large, nor changed his course, but through the shaggy hill, passed underneath, engulfed, for God had thrown that mountain as his garden mold high raised, upon the rapid current, which, through veins of porous earth, with kindly thirst updrawn, rose a fresh fountain, and with many a rill watered the garden. Thence united fell, down the steep glade, and met the nether flood, which from his darksome passage now appears, and now divided into 4 main streams, runs diverse, wandering many a famous realm and country whereof here needs no account, but rather to tell how, if art could tell, how from that sapphire fount the crisped brooks rolling on orient pearl and sands of gold, with mazy pendants under our with mazy error under pendant shades, ran nectar, visiting each plant, and fed flowers worthy of paradise, which not nice art, in beds and curious knots, but nature boon, poured forth profuse on hill and dale and plain, both where the morning sun first warmly smote the open field, and where the unpierced shade embraced the noontide bowers. Okay. All right. Now, here's
Hypnotic.
one thing.
Hypnotic.
It is.
Yeah. And I can see the influence
effect
on Cormac and on modern prose and language.
Yeah. Now here's one thing that's interesting, an interesting theological challenge for Milton that he has to deal with here, trying to represent unfallen Eden. So you think about these things, trying to represent, he'll run into this trying to represent or depict Eve, for instance. We're fallen. You, Kevin, and I, we're fallen. Everybody's fallen. Milton is fallen. How do you depict Eve's
And I
nudity?
can't get up.
Right.
Go ahead.
How do you depict Eve's nudity when Adam and Eve would have experienced each other in an unfallen state? Right. So how do you balance, like, is it erotic? Is it sensual? Like, what is it? This is something you'll see Milton sort of trying to sort his way through in this poem. Now there is, let me give you a line. I gotta shout out or at least pay sort of due attention to the fact that there is an aspect of this poem that is arguably I don't know, sexist, I guess. Let's see if I can find the exact line. It's line 299 in book 4. Is that right? Oh yeah. They're talking about Adam and Eve, and it says, Milton says, he forgot only, she forgot in him. Right. And there's several references to the fact that Adam is the sort of the superior sex in one quality or another. But Eve is also shown to have virtues as well. So it's not a clear-cut case, but I think Milton is being mostly conventional in his depiction of this relationship between man and woman. I don't think he's doing anything crazily radically, quote unquote liberal. Yeah. So I just need to put that out there. Let's see, books 5 through 8. Okay, so book 5, Eve has been talked to by the devil, by Satan, and Satan has been run off, and she recounts this dream that she had to Adam. Now, the archangel Raphael, the messenger or the healer, is sent down by God to inform Adam and Eve that they are in danger and to tell them that they are not to eat the fruit, right? And it's interesting. I don't think it's part of the biblical story that they're told they're in danger. I think they're just told not to eat the fruit, but I could be mistaken. Anyway, in so doing, Raphael recounts the war in heaven. And this is told at a level of detail that we hadn't seen up until now, because the poem Paradise Lost begins after the war in heaven has failed. And now we get Raphael's perspective on what happened. Also during this testimony, which goes on for a good quarter to a third of the book, is basically Raphael talking to Adam and explaining how everything is, how the heavens were made, how the war in heaven went, what else is out there. And this is where we get a lot of Milton's sort of more precise theological notions. We get Milton's ex deo theory of creation, as opposed to the more orthodox ex nihilo, that God made Adam and Eve and the world from some kind of pre-existent matter, from himself rather than from nothing, from the void, which, I guess choose your battles on that one. I don't know how people feel about ex nihilo versus ex deo. But interestingly, this makes it so there's basically nothing that is not matter. So Milton is, I think, what people call a monist in this case. He believes that he doesn't really believe there's such a thing as a soul distinct from the body, which is probably not a popular opinion amongst his religious contemporaries. Yeah. Also just an interesting note. Raphael eats normal food, human food, which is kind of interesting. And there's a lot about eating in this book, in Paradise Lost. And it calls to mind not only, obviously eating the apple, but there's other instances of eating. And they all seem freighted with a lot of importance to Milton. And it recalls to us the fact that Milton thought he went blind because he ate something bad, right? So this is this is a metaphor that, for Milton, that is philosophical, theological, poetic, and personal and biological somehow. Something about violating some rule, even if you didn't know it was there. Okay, moving on. Oh, here's one other quick thing. Raphael also suggests that the humans, if they remained unfallen because they're made of the same material as angels, would eventually transcend, and they would, as John Rogers of Yale says, they would metabolize the latent grossness of their bodies and become angelic. They would achieve a kind of heaven without dying, which I think is completely heretical, to my understanding.
Yeah, that's some heresy. Wee,
Yeah,
wee,
yeah,
wee.
yeah. Let me oh, and then here's the other thing we get. What is the cause for the war, and why? In it's worth asking is, what is the cause for the war in heaven? What is the sort of proximate cause? Like, oh, generally Satan is a megalomaniac and he feels like he's not getting his share, but like what was there an inciting incident? And we learn that, I'll only just read this because I want to make sure we get a little bit of Milton's voice. We're not going to read a ton of it.
God wouldn't let Satan have the controller. He was playing a 2-player game, but he would
right.
not let Satan jump in and play Tekken 3.
Precisely.
And
yeah.
it got and that shit is still, they're still talking about that in that household.
Well, it's like it was tied in with a lot of other things, you know. Sometimes he
was going undefeated, you know.
This is God, the voice of God, and I know this seems he's making God a character.
Brad, you really got to be. You're doing a great job, but you really got to milk this more, man. You got to be like, this is the voice of God.
Yeah. Oh,
you're
man.
very modest.
Okay.
You're very genteel.
I am known for my gentility.
You're a very modest guy, Brett.
Mm-hmm. I want you to think about something. Just picture Milton, though. Okay. And then he wakes up. He's been visited by an angel in the night. He calls out to his amanuensis and he says, where is he? I need to be milked. This is something he actually said, apparently.
Well, that's weird. That's a weird synchronicity. I just said that.
Yeah. It is weird.
Where is he? I need to be milked. Like he was an udder of poetry, and he needed to be milked of poetry.
Because like if you don't milk the cows, it's a problem, right? You have to be right. It's like that, for multiple reasons.
I'm using that line on my lady later. Where is she? I need to be milked. Throw that in the repertoire. See how that does out there, boys.
They love that.
Report back. Yeah. Ladies can do it too. Ladies can say it too. Yeah.
And then he has the audacity, right? He calls to be milked. The amanuensis comes in, and then he has the audacity to write in the voice of God. Now, when you're reading it along, and you might not think about this, God's a character. The events are happening. But then you realize that Milton is literally putting words in God's mouth. That's a pretty audacious thing to do, right? And here's some of them. Hear, all ye angels, progeny of light, thrones, dominations, princedoms, virtues, powers, hear my decree, which unrevoked shall stand. This day I have begot whom I declare my only son, and on this holy hill him have anointed, whom ye now behold at my right hand. Your head I him appoint, and by myself have sworn to him shall bow all knees in heaven and shall confess him Lord. Under his great vice-regent reign abide, united as one individual soul, forever happy. Him who disobeys, me disobeys, breaks union in that day, cast out from God and blessed vision, falls into utter darkness, deep engulfed, his place ordained without redemption, without end. According to Milton, why the war in heaven happened. The creation
of Christ kicks off the war in heaven because the angels are offended by. I think I knew this. This is something he created, a concept he created?
I believe that's the case. Yeah. I might be showing my theological ignorance, but I believe that.
If someone knows better, let us know. That's fascinating. Yeah. That is a fascinating concept.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, sure. It poses the Adam and Eve story, just hypothetically, like, let's say this happened. I mean, it poses the Adam and Eve story as more of the midpoint of like an ongoing conflict than it does as the start of something, right? Yeah, interesting stuff. Now, a lot of people will say that Satan makes the best arguments in the book and that he is the most compelling figure. And they will often also say that because Milton did that, Milton must have sympathies with him. And they will also say, well, Milton was part of the rebel army, right? And Satan is the rebel. So isn't he sympathizing with Satan? I'm not going to go argument to argument. It would be probably make for kind of boring radio for me to read Satan's best argument and then read Abdiel's best argument. But just know that when you get into book 7, all of Satan's best arguments are roundly refuted by an angel that stayed on the side of God. And ultimately, I think to overemphasize Milton's sympathy with the devil, and it's not that I came to this like by myself. This is from listening to people like John Rogers, doing a lot of reading, thinking very carefully about what's actually being said by all of them. I think Milton has done the thing, which is, if you really want to come up with a good argument in narrative writing, in fiction or in a play and in a film, what you have to do is you have to put a very good point in the mouth of the person who is wrong, and then you have to show why that's wrong. That's what they call now steel manning, right? And Dostoevsky is famous for doing this, and a number of other writers, where the smartest, most capable, they make an argument, and it's
kind of the dynamic that we have. That's kind of the dynamic. That's the dynamic that we have. I'll let you guess who's which is who,
and then guess which one of us thinks which one's who.
Right. It depends on the episode, I think.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
That would be a funny idea. God and Satan have a podcast.
Yeah. Right.
I'd listen to the shit out of that. I would binge that. I'd subscribe to their Patreon.
Yeah. Let's stop here a moment. We're in the middle of Paradise Lost and recount some of Milton's heresies. The poem is inspired by an angel. I don't know if that's exactly heretical, but it's a bold claim to be making. He's portraying the deity.
Putting words into God's mouth.
Putting words into God's mouth. Now, there is a point. Oh, did I not? Yeah, hold on. Let me read you something from book 1 really quick. This is really interesting. When he's calling to the muse in book 1, basically invoking, like, let me write this poem. He says, he's talking to the spirit, and he says, and chiefly thou, O spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowst, thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like, sat brooding on the vast abyss, and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark illumine, what is low and raise in support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to man. He says the spirit that he wants to inspire him is like some kind of hermaphroditic being that impregnated chaos to create the world.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's not, yeah. That's a pretty major heresy, and it's kind of never revisited. He just kind of continues on, but it's a potent image, but it's also very heretical. Milton as a monist, he's basically categorically, he might be considered an animist materialist or a vitalist, denying the idea of the soul, saying everything has a material aspect. Basically the soul is the body. The fact that your body isn't a vessel with a soul in it. You're made of matter that has been somehow charged with some kind of essence. And maybe it doesn't seem like a big difference, but to Milton, it is. Okay. That's just some of the heresies. Now, book 9, things start getting interesting because we're getting into the actual temptation where Satan lures Eve into eating the apple. And I just want to read quickly, just so you hear what these are like, the front bit of this book that is called The Argument. So Milton's argument for book 9. Satan, having compassed the earth with meditated guile, returns as a mist by night into paradise, enters into the serpent sleeping. Adam and Eve in the morning go forth to their labors, which Eve proposes to divide in several places, each laboring apart. Adam consents not, alleging the danger lest that enemy of whom they were forewarned should attempt her found alone. Eve, loath to be thought not circumspect or firm enough, urges her going apart, the rather desirous to make trial of her strength. Adam at last yields. The serpent finds her alone, his subtle approach, first gazing, then speaking, with much flattery extolling Eve above all other creatures. Eve, wondering to hear the serpent speak, asks how he attained to human speech and such understanding not till now. The serpent answers that by tasting of a certain tree in the garden, he obtained both to speech and reason, till then void of both. Eve requires him to bring her to that tree and finds it to be the tree of knowledge forbidden. The serpent, now grown bolder, with many wiles and arguments, induces her at length to eat. She, pleased with the taste, deliberates a while whether to impart thereof to Adam or not. At last brings him of the fruit, relates what persuaded her to eat thereof. Adam, at first amazed, but perceiving her loss, resolves through vehemence of love to perish with her, and, extenuating the trespass, eats also of the fruit. The effects thereof in them both, they seek to cover their nakedness, then to fall to variance and accusation of one another. So this is basically this is the book that is fundamentally Milton's recounting of what we already have in the Bible in the book of Genesis as the Adam and Eve story, the Garden of Eden story. The point that I think is interesting, and is Satan chooses to be the serpent, and he lures Eve by basically telling her, like, you could be like, I'm a snake. I ate and I learned how to talk and think. Imagine what it would do for you. Imagine how powerful it could make you. How wise and intelligent could you be if you were to eat the same thing that I ate? Very interesting. Okay. Now, let's read a little bit.
Greatest story ever told here, people.
Yeah.
There's a reason this story continues to fascinate
100%.
and move people. Yeah, it's a great story.
Absolutely.
Because it is capital T true.
I'm going to read a T.S. Eliot complaint about Milton.
As you do. I'm standing up. I am listening. I'll be right back.
Okay, gotcha.
All right.
This is from T.S. Eliot in one of his two great essays on Milton. Quote, I am not suggesting that Milton has no idea to convey which he regards as important, only that the syntax is determined by musical significance, by the auditory imagination, rather than by any attempt to follow actual speech or thought. He's basically saying Milton is not realistic. He cares more about how things sound than if they actually convey what he's trying to convey. Going on, it is at least more nearly possible to distinguish the pleasure which arises from the noise from the pleasure due to other elements than with the verse of Shakespeare, in which the auditory imagination and the imagination of the other senses are more nearly fused and fused together with the thought. The result with Milton is, in one sense of the word, rhetoric. That term is not intended to be derogatory. The kind of rhetoric is not necessarily bad in its influence, but it may be considered bad in relation to the historical life of the language as a whole. I've said elsewhere that the living English, which was Shakespeare's, became split up to two components, of which one was exploited by Milton and the other by Dryden. Okay. Going on just a little bit longer. If several very important reservations and exceptions are made, I think that it is not unprofitable to compare Milton's development with that of James Joyce. The initial similarities are musical tastes and abilities, followed by musical training and curious knowledge. Gift for acquiring languages and remarkable powers of memory, perhaps fortified by defective vision. The important difference is that Joyce's imagine is not naturally so purely an auditory type as Milton. Okay. One takeaway here is if you're ever at a cocktail party and somebody's talking about the virtues of Shakespeare versus Milton, you can say something along the lines of, well, yes, Milton was very great, but his voice is completely tuned to the auditory, whereas with Shakespeare, we have a mingling of all of the senses at once.
You were saying the other guy was Dryden?
Dryden.
Okay. This is dry.
That boy was driving. Yeah.
You want to put everybody to sleep. People actually have conversations like that. You understand? You understand me?
I don't
Yeah.
have conversations with
I,
people
I can
usually.
appreciate it sometimes, but yeah, it does get to be a little bit huffy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Although, I mean,
Agreed.
if you're going to listen to anybody, it would be T.S. Eliot.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a little he's a bit of a, what would you call it? He's a bit anal, but smart, intelligent guy for sure.
Going to say the word bit of a prig.
Bit of a prig. That's, I think, the word I was looking for.
Maybe a little mean. Maybe a little
Priggish.
mean. We'll
Yeah.
cover him eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, here's another thing. Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Yeah, never mind. I was going to read some more Eliot, but we're focusing. Eliot has these two great essays on Milton that I think if you're at all interested in Milton, you haven't read them. They are worth reading. They're landmarks in because you have to think about where T.S. Eliot's positioned. He's positioned right at the movement of literary modernism. And so they're casting back through the English language to figure out what their lineage actually is, or what actually led to now. And this is one of, it's almost like an art, it's like almost like an archaeological endeavor in some ways to understand. I guess one way to think about it is, if you're going to innovate and you're going to kind of make things keep happening, you don't have to necessarily tear down all of the statues of your heroes, but you do have to be able to see their flaws as well as their virtues, right? You have to understand. So for Eliot, he had to understand that Milton's weakness was that he was primarily focused on, according to Eliot, primarily focused on the sound rather than integrating all the elements. So if you want to be a greater poet than Milton, what do? Well, you integrate all the senses, right? It's a forensic dissection of what happened to the English language. So fascinating reading if you're into that sort of thing. Book 10 of Paradise Lost. Trying to get through this. I know it's long, but there's 12 books. I'm on book 10. So book 10.
And I trust like some sort of strange insect. Upon the completion of Paradise Lost, he immediately dropped dead. That's what like
yes,
some sort of
course.
Yeah, good. The last line, he aspirated.
Yeah.
And then he died. And then something happened to his bones later, which we'll find out. Yes, go on.
Right.
Continue.
Yeah. Book 10, we get the enacting of God's punishment to Satan to be forever a serpent, and a great scene. Satan returns to Pandemonium to find all of the devils had been turned into snakes. They're all permanently snakes now. They're all doomed. Satan is out of favor even in hell. The snakes being, quote, deluded with a show of the forbidden tree springing up before them. They seize upon the tree and they shake. It's just a moment of chaos. And basically, it's going to be hell forever now down there. It's quite a striking. Book 10 is quite striking, especially right at the end. Yeah. Hold that out. Yeah. Kevin's holding up the Bible.
Got my Bible out here.
Yeah. Yeah. Throw that on top of, when you go to bed at night, if you're reading Paradise Lost, put the Bible on top of it. Just to keep it, keep it all in
keep
there.
Keep the devil contained. Keep him in his place.
Yeah, exactly. Books 11 and 12, Adam and Eve are driven out. Michael, so Raphael came down. He was like a messenger. He was like, guys, listen, man, Satan's going to come. It's going to be rough. But if you do this, it'll be all right. And here's how the world works. And Adam's asking him questions and he's trying to answer him. And he's all cool. Michael comes down, and Michael was like the general in the war in heaven. This guy is a badass.
The avenging, yeah.
So he's got weapons and he's rough and he is not screwing around. He is the person who is to execute the punishment on Adam and Eve. He's the ones to make sure they get out of the garden and stay out, right? But an interesting thing is, Michael tells Adam everything that's going to happen to humanity. He tells them the story of Noah and the flood. He tells them of Moses. He tells them eventually of Jesus. And it's just an interesting moment. Like, I really have to think, well, why is he telling him all of this? And it's almost so he understands how weighty it is to disobey God, I suppose. It's just a fascinating turn of events of this. Just, I'm going to tell you everything that's going to happen to you now, and your people, and your children, and your children's children. Now I I suppose the last little bit, um, I'm going to read the very last bit, and then I'm going to read one or two just parts that I think are interesting. And they're all going to be kind of short. And then we'll do a little final analysis on Milton's politics at the end of this. And then we're going to kind of bring it home. Um, so book 12, get all the way, if you make it all the way to the end. And book 11 and 12 are interesting, but have been noted to be stylistically perhaps the driest of them. But I think this part at the very end is actually quite good. So I'm going to read this. This is the last, I don't know, 20 lines of Paradise Lost. And I'm not spoiling it because you already know what happens. If you don't already know what happens in the Garden of Eden story, none of this probably makes any sense.
So. Yeah. No, if you don't know the Garden of Eden story, continue to listen because you're going to learn it right now on Art of Darkness. Yeah.
So Adam and Eve have eaten of the fruit and they're being kicked out of heaven now. And they've been explained to them why and what's going to happen. And the whole history of the Bible has been laid out before them. Quote, the archangel stood, and from the other hill to their fixed station, all in bright array, the cherubim descended. On the ground, gliding meteorious, like a meteor, gliding like a meteor, and as evening mist risen from a river o'er the marish glades, and gathers ground fast as the laborers heel homeward returning. High in front advanced, the brandished sword of God before them blazed, fierce as a comet, which with torrid heat and vapor, as the Libyan air adust, began to parch that temperate clime, whereas in either hand the hastening angel caught our lingering parents, and to the eastern gate led them direct, and down the cliff as fast to the subjected plain, then disappeared. They, looking back, all the eastern side beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the gate, with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms, some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They hand in hand with wandering steps and slow through Eden took their solitary way. And then all of human history happened, right? So there's on this sort of, and there's, and I think this really, for me, I know there's heretical aspects to this, and but it really drove home to me the significance of the Garden of Eden story, like the actual potency of it. Believe it to whatever extent you want. As a story, it speaks to something deep and almost in our DNA. And this, I think the real virtue of Paradise Lost is not necessarily that John Milton was right about every aspect of it, but he forces you to think about that story from so many different angles at such a depth that whatever you end up believing about the Garden of Eden story, you come out with a richer ability to handle it in your own head. You just have more of it. You've spent so much more time in its place thinking through what all the significance is. Let me read real quickly this is Abdiel responding to Satan during the war in heaven. This is when Satan was trying to convince the angel Abdiel to join him, and Abdiel didn't. He says to Satan, apostate, still thou errst, nor end will find of erring from the path of truth remote. Unjustly thou depravest it with the name of servitude to serve whom God ordains, or nature. God and nature bid the same. When he who rules is worthiest and excels them who he governs. This is servitude to serve the unwise, or him who hath rebelled against his worthier, so as thine now serve thee. Thyself not free, but to thyself enthralled, yet lewdly darest our ministering upbraid. Reign thou in hell thy kingdom. Let me serve in heaven God ever blessed, and his divine behests obey, worthiest to be obeyed, yet chains in hell, not realms expect. Meanwhile, from me returned, as erst thou saidst, from flight, this greeting on thy imperious crest receive. Now, I don't expect people listening to this to have digested every single word in there, but fundamentally what he's combating against. Earlier, Satan had a very famous speech in which one thing he said is it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And what Abdiel basically is saying here is like, we should be led by the worthiest, in this case God. The worthiest should lead, and if you're following the worthiest, that's not actually servitude. That's not subjugation to follow the most worthy person in our like personal day-to-day terms, the worthiest person. And in these terms, to follow God, right? It's a narcissistic megalomaniacal thing to go against what might be the worthiest authority that there is. Which makes it interesting because, Milton was the revolutionary. Milton called for the head of the king. Now, is the king the worthiest person? Maybe not. Cromwell doesn't seem to have been the worthiest person either. So, right. So it's just strange that Milton writes this long, intense book that in a lot of ways reifies hierarchy. Though he was a person who'd spent a lot of his life trying to tear the hierarchies apart, if that makes sense. So it's sort of like, what is his thinking here? There's been a lot of discussion about what this means for where Milton's politics were. John Rogers, when the professor from Yale, what he basically says is that so Milton had talked a lot about the people, and in Paradise Lost, the people really have more in common with Satan and the angels. When I say the people, I mean like you and I, right? The people out there in the world, in the community, seem to have more in common with sort of Satan and the devils than they do with Adam and Eve. John Rogers says that Milton's experiences through the wars, through the king coming back, through the people not being able to rule themselves, right? Milton had an ideal that people could rule themselves, and then people were given the opportunity and they didn't do a very good job of it. So Milton seems to be slowly coming around to the idea, and he says this in his later later political tracts. He basically goes from this idea that like wide open democracy to what would appear to be, and it's several steps. He goes from this wide open democracy, self-governing, to basically thinking that the country should be led by a small Puritan group of men who are all right with God. In a certain way, right? Not it's not like a diverse council of all different kinds of ideas. It's basically people who generally agree with Milton's Puritan tendencies, and that these people should basically have a monopoly on violence. And you could, this group could, one of the things that they ought to do is basically, through violence if necessary, force people to recognize the fact that they are self-determined individuals. It's a very kind of strange, almost self-contradictory perception, but it's sort of like what Milton's God is doing here. Milton's God is going to say, I know what's going to happen to you, but you've got enough free will to kind of go screw it up, but ultimately I'm in charge. So anyway, it's kind of a rambling kind of way to say Milton's idea of hierarchy in politics that is sort of suggested or implied in Paradise Lost seems to map with his own personal evolution politically. He ends towards the end of his career, he is not the wild-eyed radical that he was at the beginning of the English Civil War. He's dispirited in a lot of ways, politically, if not religiously. And he's, again, like the thing we were saying before, he wanted to write a nationalist epic, and then he realized there was no epic. There was no nation. He wanted people to rule themselves, and he realized that they were incapable of it. And so he's reckoning with all these things and all the religious implications that they would have. Now, one other quick thing, real quick about Paradise Lost, and then we're getting right to the end here. Michael, the Archangel Michael shows, it's just an interesting note. The Archangel Michael shows Adam all of history by putting this water in his eyes. It's like a medically or chemically induced revelation. And it's just very interesting that Milton would choose to do that. It's right at the end where basically Michael administers this thing, and Adam has like a vision. He has like a hallucinatory vision of history laid out before him. It's very interesting. Okay. How is Paradise Lost received? Well, here's one thing I will give you. From the BBC article, Why You Should Reread Paradise Lost. Quote, Paradise Lost gained immediate acclaim even among royalists. Even Milton's enemies thought this was a masterpiece. The poet laureate John Dryden reworked Milton's epic, casting Cromwell in the role of Satan. Dryden's version also rhymed. Samuel Johnson would rank Samuel Johnson, who thought Milton in some ways was despicable and could not account for the regicide, ranked Paradise Lost among the highest, quote, productions of the human mind. But not all critics were so favorable. The 20th century brought us the, quote, Milton controversy, during which his legacy was fiercely contested. We talked about this a little bit. So anyway, interestingly enough, he remains controversial and debatable up till right now, this conversation we're having, I suppose. Let's see, what else has he got going on? He writes Paradise Regained, which we're not going to talk a whole lot about. It's basically Jesus. It's the story of Jesus being tempted by Satan and winning, not falling into temptation. He writes Samson Agonistas, which is an epic poem about Samson. Both have, I didn't read both of them through. They're both quite interesting. Paradise Regained is a lot shorter than Paradise Lost, and it makes it sound like a sequel, and I suppose in some ways it is, but it's probably also heretical. But one thing that Milton does in there, which nobody at that time had done, is Milton tries to position Jesus as a person with an interiority, as having an individualized psychology, right? Which, according to some scholars, nobody had really attempted that since the writing of the Bible. So take that for what it's worth. Okay. So let's see. There are still political intrigues going on in these later years. 1667, the first edition of Paradise Lost comes out. 1674, Milton is dead. There's still, of course, the creeping threat of Catholicism everywhere. Are there Catholics in the room with us right now?
I'm afraid so.
Yeah, there are still attacks.
They would say, "Is there popery? Is this popery in the room right now?" I like how it sounds like potpourri. Potpourri.
Yeah.
It's the same word. The one has a lot more letters.
Yes, that's right. There are still public attacks from old royalist people who are still, and more Orthodox Anglicans. The things that Milton had said and done were not forgotten, but many people from across the continent would come to visit him while he's sitting there blind and full of gout in his country home. Like we said, he is starting to fight with his daughter. Not starting to. The fight with his daughters continues, and we're going to talk more about that in the dark room. Yeah. So and we're coming in on his death. So let me just read this last little bit from the biography, and then we're almost home here, Kevin. To
I've had a wonderful time. I've been looking forward to this one. I know you've worked your rump off, your
this
rump
one was tough.
parliament off.
This one was tough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is a slog. This is one of
Yeah.
those where you say, "Oh, I'm gonna do John Milton
Right. And you're
next
like,
year."
wait. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Like I
That's
agreed to do
that's
Dante, and I'm sort
yeah.
of going,
Yeah.
"Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. When I decided to do
oh."
Milton, yeah, last year, I was like, that's a problem for future Brad. That's
You're just like the voice of God.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
This is reading from the biography here. In July of 1674, Milton was having a bad fit of gout. His wife cooked him a meal he enjoyed, and he commented, quote, God have mercy, Betty. Her name is Elizabeth. I see thou wilt perform according to thy promise in providing me such dishes as I think fit while I live, and when I die, thou knowest that I have left thee all. Okay. Now yeah, I'm gonna keep reading this actually for a second. He was anticipating his death. His brother Christopher visited in July and found him in poor health. He said, brother, the portion due to me from Mr. Powell, my former wife's father, I leave to the unkind children I had by her, but I have received no part of it, and my will and meaning is they shall have no other benefit. Now we're going to talk more about this, but this is the Milton will. Where does the money go? Who gets it? All of that. Now, here is the last little bit. Syriac Skinner, Milton's longtime pupil and friend, author of the biography that was long called Anonymous, describes Milton's death as if he were an eyewitness. It is reminiscent of the death of Socrates, or of the virtuous men who pass mildly away at the beginning of John Donne's valediction forbidding mourning. Syriac Skinner says this: he died in a fit of the gout, but with so little pain or emotion that the time of his expiring was not perceived by those in the room. So, great man passes away rather quietly. Yeah, and yet is still with us.
Very much so. Yeah, I can't. I'm gonna have to go shower. I'm gonna have to go get him off me.
Yeah.
He's a tough one. He's a tricky fellow. Yeah,
he is.
And he had children. He had children with was it with the second wife that he had?
He had children with he had 4 children with his first wife. One of them died in infancy. He had 1 child with his second wife, but they both died. She died after. Yeah, they both. Is that right?
Okay.
Yeah, I think he was left with 3 daughters ultimately.
So 4 children by the first wife, the one who was coming and going. That was sort of okay, all right.
Who didn't seem to like him.
right.
So,
and then
how that went.
Did he and excuse me if you said this, it's been 4.5 whatever it's been.
Yeah.
Did he got divorced from her, or did she?
No, she came back and then she died. She died giving birth to the 4th child.
Got it. So he was arguing for. I'm just catching up. So 4th child. Okay, that's tragic. He lived his fair share of tragedy. Yeah.
He really did. I mean, you can say he invited some of it on his own head, but it's a lot of death. And like I said, man, these fires and these plagues, like life was hard.
We can't really overstate too how death in childbirth was, if not common, it was like kind of expected or like not unheard of.
Oh yeah.
You would know somebody who died in childbirth or whatever. And and that is sort of that story is kind of about that. The agony after the garden. Mm-hmm. It's all tied up. It's all tied up together. So
because we weren't there. You weren't giving birth in the garden.
No,
that's not how it worked.
No, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it stands to reason, he was probably aware of that. And he's just trying to wrestle with it and make sense of it. And then he had a 3rd wife, and there was a huge age gap for number 2 and number 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around what I just heard.
That's
Great job, Brad.
Thanks, man.
We're gonna come back on the After Dark. We're gonna do more about Milton. I got Dante coming up. We're talking about doing a Twitter Spaces or whatever, an X Spaces on the Bird website.
Yeah.
Brad and I are gonna have a big production meeting in northern Michigan in the coming weeks. It's my birthday coming up.
It is your birthday. That's
my
right.
birthday, and my little son is going to turn 3 years old on the very same day. We share a birthday,
awesome.
so
that's cool.
That's coming up. We just delivered this. We just delivered the Frida Kahlo episode, and we hope you're enjoying Art of Darkness. There are new listeners coming along all the time, and we watch the numbers. We're just chugging away, churning away at our little war, our little rebellion against the podcast gods.
That's right.
We're going to take the throne.
Kevin, I got to ask you real quick. Closing question. What do you think Milton's doing?
I think he's shit posting on Twitter. I mean, it depends on what period of Milton we're getting, right? Are we getting old blind Milton?
Yeah.
I think old blind Milton. Maybe writing, probably using more modern tools. He might still be shit posting on Twitter. He'd have all sorts of like accessibility tools, and he could just be, torturing the hell out of people, out of his political enemies. Although I like to think that like older, aged Milton maybe would still be sitting down to write the great, long, epic.
I like
masterpiece. Younger Milton was definitely a shit posting edgelord troll on Twitter who would have who also then ended up with a government job, at a very high level after it got real.
I mean, he literally doxed a guy. He contacted people in a foreign country who had dirt on somebody, on one of his enemies, right? Yeah.
That nothing changes. Brad, I know what it feels like to finish one of these core episodes. Great work. That was a lot of fun. We just gotta come back for the After Dark and cover, what are we talking about? And this for Patreon. You get all the After Darks. You should subscribe. It's awesome. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod.
We're talking about the scandals around Milton and his daughters and the money. And we're talking about what happened one drunken night to Milton's bones. Yeah, it's a good story. Cool. Yeah.
Okay, I'm really excited about that. What would you say? It's better to have an independent podcast in hell than some normie tier establishment show in heaven.
Yeah.